Okay, let me ask the panelists to come up so we can get going here. Find your spot. Yeah. I'm in the right place. Yeah, I'm in the right place. Teresa, are we ready? Shall I begin? Okay. Thanks, and welcome back to our continuation of our discussion on risk. This will be risk with a little bit of a different spin to it. And so I look forward to an engaging discussion with our panel here. We have a bunch of folks on the webinar, so I'll send out a welcome to all of those people. They won't notice the powdered sugar on my jacket from the beignets. So great to be here in New Orleans. My name is Dan Brown. I'm the moderator for this panel discussion on risk. And let me introduce our panelists, starting from my far left, Dr. Doug Gransberg. He's a professor of construction engineering at Iowa State, about to retire, as I understand, and has a long career of dealing with issues pertaining to contract delivery and risk. George Burke, on his right, is over 30 years with Hayward Baker before semi-retiring, I'm told, in 2015. That means you only have to work 40 hours a week, I suppose. So George, very distinguished person, sort of representing the specialty contractor perspective on things. John Bischoff, to George's right and my immediate left, is graduated from Utah State University and has been practicing for over 30 years, mostly with the Utah Department of Transportation, giving us the owner's perspective for the panel. Vic Donald, to my immediate right, is the National Director of Geotechnical Services for Terracon. So Vic is a long-time practicing geotechnical engineer, giving us then the perspective of geotechnical consultants. Steve Say, to Vic's right, is a senior geotechnical engineer and design build geotechnical technical lead with Kiewit projects across North America, so a lot of involvement on behalf of the general contractor in big design build projects. And to the far right, our token lawyer on the panel, Rick Calson. Rick is a good guy and does a lot of work with contractor members of DFI and others throughout the United States, and will give us some perspective from the legal point of view. So without further ado, let me make a few opening comments. So this panel discussion is regarding uncertainty in subsurface conditions and the impacts on the stakeholders in the project. So we heard from Eric and Dave earlier this morning about risks really associated with performance. And we're going to talk really more about risks as impact the stakeholders in the project, including the owner and performance risks, but a little bit more from a personal level for all of us involved. And I taught for many years at Auburn University. I thought back about how we teach our students in civil engineering about fundamental understandings of soil behavior. These are all good things. Focusing on technical solutions to well-defined problems. If we can give them a problem and give them the equations, and then they can plug in the numbers in the equations and come out with an answer. Okay, these are all useful things. Less materials are more efficient solutions. Those are typical things that engineers try to do. But how the real world works is usually defining the problem is the biggest part of the problem. As Eric and Dave showed us this morning, really it's understanding what is the problem, what soil and rock is there, and where is it. The biggest problem is defining the problem. And on top of all of this, engineering, which we've heard a lot about this morning, is intertwined with business issues and risks and responsibilities of all of those of us who are involved. Schedule and constructability are also critical, important components that have cost and other impacts on all of the stakeholders in the projects. So impacts of risk, delay, if there's problems associated with having to redesign or do things in a different way, delay, the project's not delivered on time, costs, projects run over budget, expectations are not met, or changes to design or scope of work for unanticipated conditions. All of these impact the jobs, and there are consequential impacts of these from certainly political credibility. So what big infrastructure project gets announced that the public believes what the politicians tell them it's going to cost? None. So this impacts, you know, our faith in our public institutions. There's reduced budgets for infrastructure needs. We heard Eric talking about, you know, how to spend things wisely. Impacts on the traveling public, professional, commercial reputations, and economic loss when a project goes bad, and sometimes long drawn-out in litigation afterwards with costs, direct costs and lost productivity associated with these things. So we're going to talk a little bit about how subsurface risks are identified and allocated through contract delivery, and I put in here some of the stakeholders: the owner, the general contractor, specialty contractor, the engineers, both the civil, structural, and the geotechnical. I didn't draw arrows because the arrows move around depending on what type of contract it is. If it's conventional bid build, design build, we're getting into now a lot of these design build finance P3 projects, CMGC, construction manager at risk, construction manager, general contractor. So all of these things impact how we execute projects. And so my question to the panel, and each is going to get up and make a few remarks, and I'm going to start it off with this question. From your perspective, what are the most important issues that our industry needs to confront and develop consensus, that is best practice, to improve practice related to subsurface risk? And to start this off, I'm saying this panel discussion is really a kickoff to a industry-wide collaborative effort that we're going to try to initiate with DFI and over the years to come. So we've talked about this with other organizations, ADSC, the PDCA, the Geo Institute, and it certainly is an important topic that impacts us all. And if we can identify some of the most important things and establish some principles that we can all agree upon, I think that will be a step in the right direction. And you'll hear more about this as we go along. So this panel discussion will be sort of the opening act in hopefully a productive effort in the years to come. So I'm going to start off with our panel. Okay, I've got a slide here. I introduced them already, so I'm not going to do that again. We're going to start off with Doug Gransberg and talk about geotechnical risk from his perspective of having done research on this subject.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. This is a subject that I've been involved in very, very closely, even during my first career with the Corps of Engineers. I got the opportunity to get in this. These are the three most recent research projects funded by TRB that talked about geotechnical risk, and I led two and was on the other one. And the point I want to make is that these research teams were not just a bunch of geotechnical engineers. They included construction engineers like myself and attorneys. In fact, Mike Loulakis out of Reston, Virginia, who's fairly well known in the design-build world, having developed the design-build standard forms for DBIA, was in on all three of them, and he and I have been partners for a long time in this particular area. The last one is one that I'm theoretically not allowed to talk about. It's going to be hard because we're done. So let me just show you what we've found in these particular things. The main issue is that we use alternative project delivery and not just design build to accelerate the project delivery. So we're on an aggressive schedule normally. We have to deal with trying to get packages out the door so that we can start construction. And the major hurdle is the owner approving the design, and in this particular context, the geotechnical design. one of my Army buddies who went on to a second career as a design-build contractor said that waiting on a DOT design approval is like sprinting in place holding your breath. And, you know, the bottom line is design-build's a construction project. We intend to build something. We wouldn't be doing the design if we didn't. And so we've got to get constructability into the process. Second thing, you know, the first thing that we have to design typically is what's under the ground. It's also the first thing that we have to build. So the geotechnical community, whether they're specialty contractors or they're specialty consultants, are the ones that are essentially under the gun right away as soon as we award that, that project. And so the idea is we need to get this stuff, the design stuff, certainly done as expeditiously as possible. And the owner needs to reduce the geotechnical uncertainty as fast as they can. And to be honest with you, there's only one way to reduce geotechnical uncertainty, and that's to dig a hole and see what's actually there, as opposed to trying to do more and more testing. So the idea then is to try to accelerate this geotechnical construction process to the point that we find the differing site conditions as early as possible so that we can deal with those particular risks that are actually going to be realized. Different ways to manage the risk. The first two bullets essentially put your best people on the design build project. Not only requiring the design builder to have highly qualified geotechnical design and construction staff, but also the agency bringing their A-team to the project as well. We need to make these decisions. We need highly experienced people to make hard decisions fast in these types of projects. One of the other ones is possible is to, rather than dink around trying to get a whole bunch of innovation and creativity, which is the two buzzwords you see associated with design build, you know, if we need to do this fast, maybe the agency needs to prescribe a geotechnical design solution that they're happy with, and then allow the industry to furnish alternative technical concepts during the procurement process as a way of bettering that baseline design. And then last but not least, one of them that we found is you'll see the upshot of these three research projects is that the geotechnical piece of the design build project is different than everything that's above the ground. And so therefore, we are advocating treating it differently to include perhaps using a different quality management system that's more toward the traditional, to what the owner is most comfortable with. Other ways to do it is during the bidding phase, to actually talk to each other. You know, we haven't done the design yet. So this design bid build mentality that we have is one of the great hindering factors to quantifying the risk. And so having confidential one-on-one meetings, those aren't just to get innovation and creativity. We've found those things also provide an opportunity to clarify ambiguities and to say, gee, is this what you really meant when you put this particular words in there? And then also to allow the competing teams to ask for additional site investigation. Differing site condition clauses are not mandated by Federal Highway Administration in design build projects. And so a number of states don't do that. Well, we've found that differing site condition clauses actually do add value because they do apportion the risk in accordance with the way the clause is drawn up. Looking at risk sharing clauses, the Washington DOT and a number of other ones will actually set a fixed amount of differing site conditions that go in the bid. And then anything above that, the state is responsible for. And that's just an example of one of the tools. And then expedited design reviews. You know, perhaps instead of doing the typical put together a review package, throw it over the wall, and then play ping pong with comments with the reviewers that are different than the initial reviewers and all the other sins that we have in the design bid build design contract system, maybe we got to just get in the room together and design it and go through it as fast as possible so that we can get out there and get busy. The thing that owners have to remember, they're asking the design builder to commit to a firm fixed price before the design is complete, and more often before the site investigation has been completed. So that is the one culture shift that owners need to really recommend or really understand. In my last tour with the Corps of Engineers way back in the dark ages, I retired in '94, I actually had to do $200 million a year with the design build projects with an agency that was still in the design bid build mentality. And I can tell you, it took me a while to realize the reason the prices are they are is because of the way the risks are allocated or actually shed in the contract boilerplate. So how do we equitably distribute it? We have three contractual tools that have been successfully used. One is progressive design build delivery, where it goes the same way as CM at risk or CMGC. You pick your design build team on a basis of qualifications and then negotiate a guaranteed maximum price for the construction. That allows you then to negotiate the risk during the design process and to use the design process as a way to gain early contractor involvement. Scope validation periods after award, Virginia DOT uses this, others have used it, and that's essentially a period where the design builder is allowed to go out and validate what their bid has, what they assumed, and if there are any changes, to go ahead and deal with those at that point in time. And then last but not least, the multiple notices to proceed, and what we're talking here is not a notice to proceed for design and a notice to proceed for construction, but rather a notice to proceed for early geotechnical excavations and other types of things so that we can find the differing site conditions rather than spend a whole lot of time arguing about whether they're materially different than what we would have expected. The legal synthesis that I showed there was pretty conclusive. It's very difficult for the owner to dodge the geotechnical differing site condition risk by putting exculpatory language like the contractor must thoroughly familiarize them with the site, and you all heard the clauses. At the end of the day, the only time owners win this is on a technicality usually, and it's like the contractor didn't turn in the claim fast enough. So those are ways to deal with it. The 2444 report, like I say, we just finished it. Essentially, if it gets adopted as the AASHTO guide, which is the intent when the project was let, what we have are 5 strategies that for managing geotechnical risk, to include the idea of treating geotechnical subsurface stuff, to include utilities, differently than we do with the rest of the project. And then 25 risk management tools that were found to be effective in the field during that period of time. So, major conclusion: we need to align the owners and the design builders' risk perceptions as early as practical, as well as align their business objectives. I personally believe that one of the things we need to do to change our industry for the better is to get off the idea that saving money is the objective of the design process. I think we ought to be focusing not on getting it as cheap as possible, but on focusing on cost certainty and schedule certainty. So finish it on budget, on time. Now, I realize that's a radical change. Unfortunately, when we try to get as cheap and fast as possible, what do we end up getting? It goes over budget, as Dan mentioned, and behind schedule. And so that's what we found out on the research side. And with that, I'll turn it over to whoever.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, very good. I will ask you one sort of follow-up question. When you get multiple bidders submitting at a fixed price, obviously the one that does not perceive the risk to be as severe, I mean, we all accept risk or we wouldn't be in this business, but the one that perceives the least risk is often the one that wins the job. Then the owner has the benefit seeing the bid from the one that saw the most risk. So how does that kind of get reconciled, and how does that affect in the post-award business?
Well, first and foremost, in design bid build, there's nothing you can do about it, okay? It's a low bid system. However, if you take design build P3 CMGC and turn it into a low bid system, then you've got a problem. So first, we need to make it a true best value so that the one that has the best value actually wins rather than the low bidder. And I've actually done studies on that. 93% of the time, the low bidders win design build projects. The second thing are stipends. And so with a stipend, you're paying somebody for their ideas. If they choose not to cash the check, then their proposal is then proprietary. If they do that, the owner gets it, and the owner's able then to give that to the winning team, and then use that difference in risk analysis. And this is where having a progressive design build is nice because there isn't a low bid selection. We'll negotiate the price, but that becomes the major issue.
Okay, so thank you, Doug, and sort of moving along, and we'll start now at the really at the top of the food chain with the owner's perspective. He's denying that he's the top of the food chain. Okay. Yeah, I think you can hit enter.
Well, thank you. I noticed they sat me right by the controller that does green, yellow, or red. I don't know if that's an indication of what the owners are supposed to be control of, but anyway. So what I'm going to go over today is some of the hot topics from an owner's perspective on risk. And it seems like this is kind of evolved to a talk about a design build contracting situation, and I'm not sure that we want to limit it to just design build discussion, but that seems to be where it's gone. So what are some of the topics that concern an owner? What level investigation is adequate for a DB contractor without significantly adding to his bid to accommodate risk? How is the differing site conditions clause different for a design bid build contract versus a design build contract? How is the owner to control construction remedies that may not be foreseen? And how much weight is given to geotechnical and DB technical portions of proposals? So it's been UDOT's policy to, and that's Utah Department of Transportation, to conduct approximately what we would consider 75% of the investigation of a normal project. And that's to our manual of instruction requirements, which is in line with the AASHTO subsurface investigation requirements. And for example, we would maybe drill 3 of the 4 borings at a bridge site and allow the contractor to complete the 4th one and put it where he wants, to where it's most advantage to him. So how are differing site conditions clauses different for design bid build versus design build? Well, in design bid build, this is UDOT's current clauses, and I'm not saying they're correct. In fact, they're probably not very good, but here we go. So for a design bid build, the differing site conditions, subsurface or latent physical conditions at the project site that differ significantly from those indicated in the contract, present unknown physical conditions of an unusual nature that differ materially from those normally encountered and generally recognized as inherent in the nature of the required work. Now, if we compare that to what the current different site conditions clause is for DB. It's more in a paragraph language here, but the design builder acknowledges, and this is something that Doug indicates doesn't work very well, acknowledges that it is responsible for obtaining any additional information the design builder needs to perform the work that has not been provided in the contract documents. As a result of its review, inspection, examination, and other activities, the design builder is familiar with and accepts the physical requirements of the work and the risk allocations associated with such work set forth in the contract documents, including Section 4, differing site conditions. And this is what is said in Section 4 of the RFP. The term differing site conditions shall mean subsurface or latent conditions encountered at exact boring locations included in Part 8 of the RFP. And that's basically the subsurface data that differ materially from those indicated for such locations. And then no differing site conditions claims are allowed on approved ATCs. I also will note that on design bid build, we allow value engineering proposals, which the owner and the contractor share the savings of costs for those proposals. And it's UDOT's perception that the contractor risk, that the geotech risk is shed to the contractor on value engineering proposals. So getting down into the weeds a little bit, here's a crazy remedy that a design builder came up with for an out-of-plumb H-pile. It was accepted and stamped by the contractor's designer. So what's the owner's recourse for such occurrences? The design builder comes and tells me, it's great, my engineer stamped it. How can you refute this? Well, what we do is we improve our specs for the next job, and so what we did was we made an addition to our standard specification that spliced pile sections must be parallel. So, I mean, you'd think that'd go without saying, but you never know. On a ladder project, a contractor started pushing the piles into place that were out of plumb, and that was also accepted by his engineer. So moving on to how much weight is assigned to Geotech on DB proposal evaluations. And this is just kind of a history of what UDOT has done in the past. In 1996 on the I-15 project, 50% of the RFP was technical, of which 10% weight was given to Geotech. In the mid-2000s, 20 to 30% was technical, and 10% of that was Geotech. And now in the 2010s, 10 to 20% of the RFP is judged on technical and 0% on Geotech, but with a Geotech fatal flaw rejection clause. And I'll just make a final comment. We still haven't got our arms wrapped around liquefaction and lateral spread mitigation. We find that if we do not quantify it prior to bid and have the contractor bid on the quantified problem, that the problem seems to go away. And in that case, we call that geofantasizing the problem away, and we don't like that. And so with that, I'll turn the time back over to.
Thank you, John. Of course, I have a question for you. Related to the value engineering and ATC, you said basically the risk is shed to the contractor. So if a contractor is contemplating proposing a value engineering alternative that might provide value to the owner, but thereby transfers more risk onto themselves, I mean, what crazy contractor would do that?
Well, a contractor that might want to go spend some money on a little investigation based on some money that he's going to get back. So, and I don't know that it's hindered the process. With UDOT and contractors, we have good relationships with our contractors, but possibly it has, and it's a good question to consider.
Yep. Okay. Okay, very good. So next, Rick Calson with the legal perspective.
Good morning, everyone. This is usually the point where I make a self-deprecating lawyer joke to get you to like me just a little bit more, because people don't like lawyers, but we're a little behind in the schedule, so I will spare you that this morning. What I do want to do, I want to bring you into my world for just a few minutes, and that's the world of a construction lawyer, specifically one who generally represents drilling contractors in subsurface construction disputes. So how do we see these issues that are in front of you all week here at the DFI conference? Well, it all starts in 1918. The United States Supreme Court in the Spearin case says the following: if you build per plans and specs as a contractor and there's a defect in the result, you as the contractor don't own that defect. The owner owns it, and by implication, the designer of the work owns it. In other words, I get paid extra if my failure to perform is caused by somebody else. That seems pretty reasonable and fair. Now, in order to recover, you really do have to build exactly per the plans and specs that you later say are defective. What often happens is a contractor trying to do the right thing will make their own design midway through the project and deviate from the plans and specs, meaning well, but in that case, you're not going to get paid. So now that we know what the Spearin Doctrine provides, let's talk about the ways in which owners have tried to evade the clear intent of the Spearin Doctrine now for 99 years. They've tried to get around this decision. And they've done it through owner contractual disclaimers, or what I would call an exculpatory clause, but what most of my clients call a weasel clause. And what the weasel clause provides is that there are a couple of them. Number one, and everybody has this hit list in their head, and we see it on every job. Number one, here's all this geotechnical information. And I, as the owner, have had years and years, if not decades, to accumulate this information. And when you bid, really take this information into account to give me a lower bid. But then when you build, by the way, I never gave that to you. It doesn't exist. It evaporates. It's really hard to bid classified and build unclassified. I'm sure some of my panel members are not happy with what I'm saying right now. But that's how we see it as lawyers as well. So we have a duty as a contractor to investigate. And what's very hard about that is, I think that you do have a duty to investigate anything above ground that you can see. Don't go on the job site and complain that there are aerial wires and you can't get your rig in. I'm not sympathetic about that, nor are the courts. The question is, should I know what's below the ground? In most states differ on that, to where even if it says that I have a duty as a contractor to investigate what's below the ground, each state will see it differently. From a practical perspective, it's very difficult to do. And I always ask at presentations or at depositions under oath, all right, give me an example of one time that somebody actually did do a subsurface investigation before they got the job. And usually the answer is never, or I know it happened once, I just can't give you the details, but I'm sure that it happened and you should have done that too. The picture in my head is of the following. We're at a very tight job site in a packed metro area like Boston or DC or New York or Chicago. And on this postage stamp size lot, there are 6 bidders, and they're all performing their own cores a month before the job. And that just isn't practical, and most courts know that's not practical, and therefore they don't enforce these clauses. The other thing to take into account, and by the way, getting your insurance to cover you when you go onto one of these sites and getting the owner to give you permission if you actually ask is quite difficult. Then the other clause that I really want to bring up today is the notice clause. Notice clauses have gotten shorter and shorter and shorter. When I first started doing this in the early 90s, you had 21 days to give notice. Then it became 14, then it became 10. Okay, we can still do it. Then it became 5, 3, 2, 1, 24 hours to give notice. So that means that if you hit the Rock of Gibraltar on Friday afternoon at 3:30, your notice better be in by Saturday at 3:30. There's several problems to that. We'll talk about it more. But Friday at 3:30, most people are thinking about Miller time, not turning around a claim within 24 hours. Many states it's still not enforceable. And we'll also talk about superior knowledge doctrine in a moment. All right, so basic definitions in Utah pretty much follows these. Utah, if you saw his two slides, Mr. Bischoff's slides, this is what Utah is talking about. Number one, there are two ways I can prove a differing site condition. Under federal law, and most states have adopted these. A type 1 differing site condition claim, you see the definition there. I'm not going to read it to you. But what it basically provides is if I encounter something different than what is described in the contract documents, I get paid for it. Therefore, if on the southeast corner of the site I hit a boulder at 20 feet and there's no mention of boulders in that southeast corner of the site or at that elevation, I'm going to get paid. The second one, which is much, much harder to prove and therefore is not utilized as often, is a type 2 differing site condition. In English, what this means is you hit something totally different than would ever be expected in that geographic area. So I'm drilling, let's say, in Arizona, and I hit karst. I'm not in the karst region. I'm entitled to an extra. Or if I'm drilling in an area without a lot of water expected underground, I get paid. This one's very hard to win. There was a case in Texas about 5 years ago on an I-35W near Austin, and the lawyer for that contractor put together a beautiful Type 2 claim saying there is no way around Austin, Texas, we would expect this type of rock formation. The only problem was the client, the drilling contractor client, testified at his deposition that each exit in I-35W was totally different and you could expect anything. And the truth is, well, number one, that was the end of the case. They're out of business now. I won't say who it was. But you can't expect anything, so those are pretty difficult. Okay, so before I wrap this up, I do want to give you a couple action items. Number one, the weasel clause known as the notice clause. Since the recession of 2009, these clauses are increasingly enforced by courts. It used to be the first letter I would get from an owner was, you blew the notice, and I would send them back a 4-page scholarly letter on how that wasn't valid. Most states now it is valid. So you have to be very careful about this. To the extent that you're working on private work, action item number one is never negotiate for less than 3 business days. You can't turn around a claim for a differing site condition as a contractor, in my opinion, in less than 3 business days. That means from the field, from your operator hitting the rock that you don't expect, to your superintendent, to the office, and out to the general contractor. Number two, I want to make sure that everybody on your team knows what your notice provision is. So if you're working especially on a public job and you don't get to negotiate it, does your team know? Does your team know that they have to turn it around in 24 hours? And this is usually when I ask people, do you know what the notice provision is on the jobs you're currently working on? And usually I get a lot of nervous giggles and very few hands going up. Your entire team must know what the notice provision is if you're to get your claim in on time. All right, finally, the easiest way to win a differing site condition claim is the doctrine of superior knowledge. What this means is that the agency you're working for has additional information about the subsurface that they don't share with you. It doesn't mean that they're dishonest. We know that Utah Department of Transportation ethics are unparalleled in business in America, but sometimes they make mistakes and they don't provide all the information to you, which can range from something like additional geotech reports that were taken on that site or on surrounding job sites. I was involved in a case where it was a sinkhole case. Our report only contained very vague sinkhole references. Every other report on that job site or on that owner site had 8 red flags on sinkholes. So one action item for you to think about is that when you encounter something different, write to the owner or through the general contractor to the owner and ask them, let me see all the information you have, not just about this site, but all the adjoining sites that you know. So in conclusion, really the 2 things that I would like to see change are more investment in subsurface investigation prior to the job in order to eliminate as much of the litigation as we see. I think it's a good investment under the pay me now or pay me later standard. And 2, could we have some reasonable risk allocation? I'd like to see the end of 24-hour notice clauses that aren't helpful and the onerous site condition clauses that we talked about before.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick. I'm going to ask one follow-on about this notice provision. Oftentimes you hit something strange. You don't realize it's a DS. It's going to be a DSC until you've struggled with it a little while. At what point is the notice provision triggered for a contract?
Okay. So at what point is the notice provision triggered? It depends on the state and the court. In many states now, the second you hit something that should put you on an alert that it is different, even if you don't know exactly what it is, once you know it is different, you better get your notice out. You can supplement the notice later with precisely what it is. But in the short term, err on getting the notice out.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. So next we're going to have Steve Say, the representative of GC.
Good morning, everyone. So a couple of key concepts from my perspective on large design build projects. The first one is that most of the cost and risk reductions are related to the means and methods, and these decisions occur in the proposal or bid stage. The other concept is the final design and initiation of the construction are really driven by the schedule, and big changes, significant changes just simply don't occur in practice through there. One of the things that it took me a long time to learn at Kiewit was if the concept's not in the proposal or the bid, it's likely to not be done in final design. There are too many other factors that drive things, predominantly schedule, that keep this big ship on the straight line through there. For this pre-bid subsurface risk, it's my opinion that everybody's interest in the project is served by having the project team focusing on how to deal with the subsurface conditions rather than spending significant effort and resources in trying to define what those subsurface conditions are. In my opinion, the owner's geotechnical engineer can materially improve this issue, but they have to spend time and money to be able to do that. And in the context of these design build projects, it's my opinion that baseline geotechnical reports can significantly reduce this subsurface risk. In this context, I believe I would like to see the owner's geotechnical engineer focus on defining what the important factors are that will significantly impact both the cost and the schedule of the project. I want them to think about the subsurface conditions. They also need to see that there's sufficient geotechnical information so that a competitive proposal can be developed, including a clear definition of what those ground conditions are. And for design build projects, let's focus on the site characterization. a pile design on a design-build project doesn't do me very much good if we're bidding drilled shafts. From my perspective, I'm going to draw on the experiences of two projects that Kiewit had in Honolulu, Hawaii for the high-capacity mass transit project. The two projects totaled about $800 million. One of the projects is substantially complete. The second project is still underway. A key feature that we think of through here is an elevated guideway in the westerly reaches of Honolulu, where each support is supported on a monoshaft foundation. And those foundations are spaced about 125-foot intervals for 16 miles. In this particular instance, geotechnical baseline reports were prepared by Parsons Brinkerhoff, now WSP, and really based upon borings that were at 500 to 1,000-foot intervals through there. For those of you that are familiar with Honolulu, it's essentially the two projects were north of Pearl Harbor. This would be a schematic example of what was provided in the baseline report. An example of the things that were important to the estimate team was that the ground conditions, in my belief, could be fairly easily visualized. In this particular case, the orange color is really the softer ground conditions. The green color was where most of the foundations were going to bear, and then the gray colors would be the basalt or rock. Each of those had specific instances through there, but the estimate team could go in through there and reasonably understand what we were dealing with through there. The other thing that I believe was particularly important is that in the baseline report we were provided profiles, not individual borings, and there was lines drawn on that gave some definition at estimate time of what we could expect between the borehole locations. From a standpoint through there in the baseline report, there's three sentences here that I don't know that we see very often at all. You know, the owner's defined purpose was to help define the contractual ground rules for the bidding process as it related to allocation and definition of the geotechnical risks there. The baselines were developed to serve as a contractual basis for comparison of the actual conditions encountered during foundation construction, and we did that. In the end of the project, one of the key cost factors was the length of the drilled shaft foundations, and those were tallied up at the end, and if they were better, it was a credit to the owner. If they were worse, they were a credit to the general contractor, but at the end of the contract, they were all tallied up, and as luck would have it, there was really no change in the contract through there. I don't know whether that was the superior nature of PV's baseline report or luck. And this was the key factor would be that the contractor may rely on these baselines in preparing his price proposal. If we think of an estimate team trying to go in through there to make a project cost less, these were three concepts that certainly did that in our project through there. The end result is there were on $800 million worth of work in challenging ground conditions. There were no claims associated with the subsurface conditions through there.
Quick question for you. When you perceive a lot of risk or very little risk, how does that affect Kiewit's decision to subcontract foundation work as opposed to self-performing?
So in the case of the Honolulu project, the risk was all driven by, and the schedule and everything was driven by getting the foundations in place. We self-performed those particular projects. It was also a particular project where we essentially defined three types of ground conditions along the project at estimate time, and then we selected specific pieces of construction equipment to deal with each of those ground conditions, and then we turned to our design team pre-bid and says, let's make sure that the designs that we have are consistent with our understanding of the geology and the equipment we want to use to construct the foundations. And I believe that that method has been very successful out in Hawaii.
So more risk would not make you, would that make you want to hire Hayward Baker or somebody, or less?
in most of the conditions, if the risk derives the schedule and the cost, we want that risk on ourselves. So we would be more inclined to do the work ourselves. Not that one wouldn't look at specific instances through there, but certainly in Hawaii, we'll look to do the work ourselves or some member of the joint venture.
Okay. So with that, we'll turn to the specialty contract.
Thank you, Dan. Well, as a responsible contractor, we're going to look at a lot of things, and these are a lot of the different risks that we should also all look at. And you'll notice that there's 14 of them there. Only 2 of them really deal with DFCs. All right, so I'm not trying to ignore the fact that when you're a contractor, you've got lots of other things to worry about, and they're all intermingled. A DFC affects a lot of other things, so you can't forget about these other things. There's still site things. And on top of that, there's also technique-specific risks. If you're doing a particular technology, they have their own issues that need to be addressed. The quality and thoroughness of geotechnical site investigation reports varies widely, as you all know. The insufficient site investigations and insufficient geotechnical information increase the risk of encountering unknown and unexpected ground conditions. No surprise. To compensate for these risks associated with the uncertainties, contractors often increase their prices. Insufficient geotechnical information at bid time also increases the likelihood of claims for differing site conditions. You've heard that repeated here. Subsurface conditions are what they are, regardless of what an investigation initially reveals. As work is done, much more is learned about these conditions. And this can reveal DFCs previously unforeseen. These unforeseen conditions will not have been accounted for by the geotechnical contractor or the prime contractor. This discussion can take many paths, and it can get legal really fast. Each party has a different agenda and tends to want to steer the resolution in that direction. And often the potential change happens when work is ongoing and extra cost and time is inevitable. And time is of the essence. Specialty geotechnical contractors have special experience that enables them to consider options not considered previously. Obviously, there is a reliance on the subsurface conditions as depicted, and often is the case that additional investigation is performed by the specialty contractor to better understand a condition. This offers an opportunity to revisit a value proposal by all parties and even renegotiate the project if possible. The process may require a better understanding of what is proposed as each party sees risk differently. There's nothing formal here, just general approaches that exist in many places and have already been discussed. For public work, delegate responsibility for developing ground treatment with a review and approval process. And I also add a backup plan. Ground conditions sometimes change what you do. They can, DFCs can change and eliminate the possibility of a technology being successful. So it's important to always have backup plans. For private work, there's often proposals, based on what is known, again, with a review approval process and a backup plan. And I would like to reiterate that the responsibility for subsurface conditions should never be passed on. They should remain with the owner. When foundation options are many, involvement of the specialist on the design side will offer the most value prior to the decision to build. Another benefit is a better understanding of schedule and subcontractor involvement. Ignoring the specialist geotechnical contractor during early construction means ignoring vast experience with a specific technique. Geotechnical construction will likely explore a much higher percentage of the subsurface conditions than the project site investigation. On some of our projects, we'll drill 1,000 holes where there were 3 borings. Will we know more after 1,000 holes? Sure we will. Contractual conditions impede direct communication and increase risk and cost. We need to look at those. We need to have a mechanism to allow value engineering proposals whenever possible. And for Eric's benefit, robust solutions should be proposed. Thank you.
George, one of your bullets said some risk can't be covered with money, or some words to that effect. Give us an example.
I'm thinking of a project that's probably about 5 years old now, where we had to create a groundwater barrier probably 30 to 50 feet below the excavation depth of a large excavation, really, just a hole in the ground. So now we've got to create a groundwater barrier in very difficult ground conditions that had groundwater infiltration requirements that were very low, and this was a very large, probably about the size of this room, groundwater barrier, and recognized that you had infiltration recommendations of maybe 500 gallons a minute, and that big a hole makes 200. Yeah. Can you be perfect in that scenario? And so if I had to think about how would I put money on it, that would mean I would have to redo the entire basement.
So
you'd double the cost.
Something that basically rendered your whole solution impossible. Yeah. Okay. So Vic Donald will give us the geotechnical engineers.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks to you and your passion for this, Dan, and DFI's leadership in general. This is an extremely important topic to us, and it's time that we do something about it. From the geotechnical consultant's point of view, it's late fall, and we're all thinking football these days, so let me use a football metaphor. Perhaps we're a lot like that right guard that's never noticed if everything goes well, but when the holding call comes up or the guy slips in and sacks the quarterback whose name and numbers plastered on the TV screen, sometimes we feel as a geotechnical consultant that we're the right guard. So, the guys on this side of the podium are supposed to have the answers, and there were a lot of great answers. You struck out with me. I've got questions that I'm going to be talking about today, so just want to mention a few of them. One is, who is the geotechnical engineer, after all? We're a unique profession that we actually kind of write our manual and decide what parameters we design with, and then we design with those parameters, and we start to talk about factors of safety and factors of fear. And that sort of thing. So that's a unique perspective. Can we do both the characterization and the actual design, and actually go out when George does his 1,000 borings where I've done 3 and see what's going on and make sure that we believe that there is a differing condition? Should we do both? Good questions. Who is the geotechnical engineer of record? There's a term that you hear a lot, but I think there's a lot of ambiguity there. We need to talk about that. So I've heard some great things. Steve was the first one to mention it, this term called the Geotechnical Baseline Report. Folks, we don't know what that is. Our profession does not know what a GBR is. We've given it an acronym, but not a definition. And I think it's time that we give it a definition. How do we represent subsurface conditions? In my firm, we're afraid to draw lines between the borings, between the sand and the clay. So who draws that line? It's pretty important, isn't it? Because we don't drill enough borings to start off with. And what is value engineering? We think we know what that is, and that's become more and more prevalent as more and more contractors get sharper and sharper, and we appreciate that. The owner wins. But as a consultant, how do we deal with that, and how can we be more innovative in our exploration work scopes? It's time to standardize. I believe that that's what we need to do. And by the way, I'll be very unashamed in my plug for my committee here, the Subsurface Characterization Committee of DFI. If you guys want to stand with us and help do this, we've got some challenges for you to get going. We need to take a stronger, better look at the public record that's out there, at the historic geotechnical information that's already available where we're about to do this first boring or anything like that. Rick, what do you call it? Superior knowledge. I think that's going to become more and more serious. You said it's the best way to get a differing site condition claim. Geotechnical engineers and owners, know your stuff and let that be your asset, not your liability. What about that local practitioner that's experienced in that area, and how confident are they in the information? I do not believe that the next investigation should be done by some book just because that's the way we've done it for the past 50 years. There's more to life than an SPT hammer. The geotechnical engineer of record is very important, and from a construction point of view, how can you do a site characterization if you don't know you're going to be putting piles to a certain depth? So there has to be an iterative understanding of, as you do a baseline report, what will be built and what value engineering would be expect from this. And so then, if we expect conditions for certain type of construction, how do we confirm that as we move into the actual construction? Think LRFD, the more you know, the less foundation you put in the ground, basically. So let's work on, as many folks have said here today, let's get it right before we get to the final design, certainly before we get into construction. How is the geotechnical consultant hired? I got news for you guys. Commoditization is killing us. The less work I propose to do on your project, the more likely you are to hire me if you're an owner. And that's just bass backwards to where we need to be. So we need to come up. We talked about qualifications-based selection for as long as I've been in the business. We need to understand what that means, and I think it's got some tie into the GBR concept and where we can go with that, because this commoditization spiral is an ugly thing to be in. I'm going to leave you with this one very simple example of how things go wrong, and I could pull one off the shelf that's happened today probably. We do about 15,000 geotechnical projects throughout the United States, and you know, a lot of them are large design build, and a lot of them are Chick-fil-A's. So you get involved with a lot of different things. These contours that are kind of hard to see represent the depth of rock below a new structure that was going to be a part of a new light rail facility. There was no understanding that the rock would plunge by 35 feet from one side of the building to the other because inadequate subsurface investigation was performed. A micropile project was designed and implemented, and the micropiles could not stand the depths that were required with the slenderness that they had, so it had to be completely redesigned. And there was obviously a lot of finger pointing and angst, and we got lawyers involved, et cetera. So what happens if you do it right? A stitch in time saves 9. Somebody said they didn't know what that meant, but I believe in that term. Stitch in time saves 9. And in this case, we need to be focusing on, and I'm preaching to the choir today. Everybody's agreeing with me. So why don't we get out and talk to the people who would really benefit from this, the owners and the other designers that don't understand our profession as well. That's where we'll be going in our committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Vic.
So how does Terracon go about handling it when you're faced with competition from somebody who just proposes to do less investigation and less money? I mean, what's Terracon's position? You have a company-wide stand on that?
Yeah, we get real mad and go back in our office. You know, Dan, when I started a practice many years ago in Baton Rouge, you and I used to work together, I had a lot of structural engineer and civil engineer clients who would want me to give the lowest bid. And I gave them a 3-word sentence, and I built a business on it. You deserve better. We would lose that job, but we would win that client by going and talking to them about, I don't want that job. But let me just tell you, if you're going to be in this business for another 20 or 30 years, you're going to have some problems. And let's talk about using a consultant and not a bidder.
All right. That's risk management for our profession. So at that point, what have we got? Just 10 or 15 minutes left. I'm going to throw it open to questions from the crowd for our panel. Questions for discussion or stimulating thoughts. What do we need to do? What could we do as far as our initiative in working with other organizations? Any suggestions or thoughts people would like to share? Yeah. John?
Well, it depends on what side of the business you're on, whether or not you know what a geotechnical baseline report is or not. That concept is a very powerful concept developed by our brethren in the underground construction business to do tunneling. And I really agree with Doug that that concept needs to be brought across to our above ground works, and geotechnical baseline report should be the standard for all projects, just not tunnel.
It seems to me that, I mean, the baseline report that Steve described said this is the basis for bidding. And then geotechnical engineers are reluctant to draw lines between borings, but that's what you have to do to have a basis to bid. So I think we've got a bit of an education mission, right, to teach people.
So if you don't mind me expanding on that, one of the case studies we did was in Ohio, and the Ohio DOT actually had a fairly, I consider, innovative way to do it. They stole it from the tunnel industry, and that was they went out and required the design builder to do a GBR. And then they negotiated the interpretation of that GBR, essentially drew the lines. And when I interviewed the contractor in the case study and all the stuff, we interviewed everybody that was involved in the project, not just the DOT. Contractor said, you know, the real risk to me isn't the geotechnical differing conditions. It's convincing the DOT that it's materially different, and the risk is, do I have to sue them to get paid? He said, on this particular one, that took that risk out of play, and I reduced my contingency by 25% for the geotechnical stuff.
Because the baseline gave you a more
because they negotiated the risk.
Yeah.
That last slide, they aligned the perception of risk, and one of the issues was cobbles, and I forget the number, but I keep getting asked, well, what if you get you have a 12-inch cobble in the GBR and you run into one that's 12 and a half? Well, the bottom line is, in that contract, that was a differing site condition, and they in fact paid for a differing site condition for cobbles that were larger than what they expected.
Yep. And Dan, I would also offer the opinion that with a baseline report, all of the teams and the owner have the same understanding of the ground conditions. Yeah. So I believe that it helps level the playing field, and it helps us all focus on how do we deal with the conditions rather than figuring out what they are.
managing risk rather than just shedding them.
Correct.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Yeah. And while she's working her way up here, Mary Ellen, if there was some questions or things coming in from, we had 300 people or so online watching, so. Okay, Liz.
Okay, so, Dan.
Stand on a stool.
Thank you. Yeah. So Dan, you and I and Steve do a lot of design builds, and I've seen lately where even though we don't have quantity risk as part of our proposal phase during a design build project, after the project is constructed, we've seen contractors come back to the engineers and say, your foundations are longer than what you put in your original proposal, and we want you to be responsible for the additional foundation length. I'd like to get some feedback on that from y'all.
Okay.
Well, at least from the Kiewit projects that I'm aware of, I don't know of a case where we've been successful in being able to claw anything back.
One of the things that is often done, I think it's in our benefit as the geotechnical engineer, and it's in everybody's benefit, is to escrow some documents that define the basis for your bid. And in fact, on a design build job, when we're working for the design build team, we make sure, even if they don't ask for it, we make sure that we produce a report that defines the basis for the design, and we get concurrence on that by Kiewit or whoever it is, and their engineers, and hopefully, I mean, on a big important project, one of the things I heard from Eric this morning was, you know, that peer review provides you some cover, right? And so if you do a good, thorough job of documenting the basis for the design, and then that changes, then you have documented that. If you don't document it, it's why did something change? I hear that from contractors all the time. You know, what changed? What changed after we won the job?
You know what the answer is? We did a geotechnical investigation, and we identified what was really there.
So you have to have a way of documenting that, right?
So Liz, I would offer the example in Hawaii is that contract format and that baseline report directly addresses your concern through there, and it provides an opportunity for everybody to get paid fairly.
The problem is most owners aren't going to provide that.
But we want them to.
Oh, of course we do. So
Okay.
What do? We encourage all owners to let us do baseline reports for every design build transportation job.
We're about out of time. We have one more question back here. We are out of time, but we're going to run over for one more question.
I think one of the things that I'm sensing here, and it's interesting having a multidisciplinary panel, is what happens a lot in reality is that people assume what other people are responsible for and what they know. The idea that the contractor is looking at a geotechnical baseline report, expecting that to address his risk, whether or not the geotechnical engineer understands the construction process and what the contractor is doing, or what the owner's requirements are and what the owner's understanding. The fact that these people are not communicating with each other well, I think, is the largest aspect of risk. The fact that we're not, you know, if we can all function as a better team and communicate with each other, then we'll, you know, the idea that I'm writing a contract to make sure you have this responsibility and you have that responsibility without letting that communication happen within the team.
That communication and acknowledgement of risks by everybody involved is a good note upon which to conclude. So I thank you all for attending. Any, Mary Ellen or Teresa, anything you need to say? Lunch is coming? I don't know. Okay, she said move out. They're going to set this room up for lunch. So thank you all for attending.
Check. Good morning, everyone. If we could ask you to please proceed to the networking break in the exhibit hall at this time, we would greatly appreciate it. The hotel staff would love to prepare this room for you to enjoy your lunch. We have some surprises for you next door, some published, maybe some not, but you won't find out about them until you go next door to the exhibit hall. take a look at what our innovative, cutting-edge companies have to offer while enjoying a taste of the New Orleans sound.